The scent of white lilies and polished wood hung heavy in the air of Balmoral Castle, a fragrance that would forever be associated with finality. In the autumn of 2022, the world was still reeling from the loss of Queen Elizabeth II, but within the ancient walls of the royal estate, the machinery of the monarchy was already turning, grinding grief into duty. It was here that the tectonic plates of the royal family shifted, placing a new weight onto the shoulders of Catherine, the newly styled Princess of Wales. The title, once held by the tragic and beloved Diana, felt to many like a crown of thorns. But for Catherine, it was a solemn vow of service. In the weeks following the Queen's death, as King Charles III acclimated to his new role, a quiet but profound dynamic began to form between the new monarch and his daughter-in-law. Charles, a man who had waited his entire life to be king, found himself in a unique position of reflection. He was undergoing his own transition, grappling with the machinery of state and the personal sorrow of losing his mother. It was during this period of shared vulnerability that he observed Catherine. He saw not just a beautiful duchess in elegant clothes, but a woman of substance, a mother shielding her children from the world's gaze, and a wife steadfastly supporting the heir to the throne. The king recognized in Catherine a stoicism that reminded him of his mother. He had watched her navigate the treacherous waters of royal life with a patience that he himself had often lacked in his younger years. He saw the way she looked at William, not with the dazzled eyes of a girl in love with a prince, but with the steady, knowing gaze of a partner. This observation planted a seed in the king's mind. He was acutely aware of the fractures in his own family, the widening chasm between his two sons that had begun as a slow crack and was now a gaping canyon. He knew that William's anger towards his brother Harry was a fire that would not easily be extinguished by a father's command. If the bridge was to be rebuilt, it would need an architect of extraordinary patience and empathy. In his quiet moments walking the windswept moors of Balmoral, Charles began to see Catherine as that architect. Meanwhile, Catherine was grappling with the enormity of her new title, the Princess of Wales. The name was a ghost as much as a title. She was intensely aware of the comparison, of the public's tendency to frame her as either Diana's successor or her antithesis. But Catherine was determined to define the role on her own terms, through quiet action rather than public pronouncement. She immersed herself in her early years projects, focusing on the foundational years of childhood, a cause she believed could prevent societal issues before they started. It was steady, unglamorous work, far from the red carpets, and it was exactly the kind of dedication that the late Queen had valued above all else. Yet, as Catherine stepped into this new light, shadows from the past began to stir. Rumors, long dormant, began to circulate in the darker corners of the media and online forums. They whispered of a secret, a doubt that the late Queen had supposedly harbored about her. These weren't the usual tabloid tittle-tattle about fashion or family holidays, and these were insidious suggestions about Catherine's emotional resilience, her fitness for the ultimate role of queen. It was a narrative designed to undermine the very foundation of the newly constituted royal family, and its source was as mysterious as it was damaging. For Catherine, who had spent over a decade proving her mettle, enduring relentless scrutiny with a smile, these whispers were a peculiar kind of poison. They targeted not her actions, but her very essence. In the privacy of Adelaide Cottage, her home in Windsor, she would sit by the fire with William, the weight of the unspoken settling between them. She did not need to ask if he had heard the rumors. She knew he had. The palace's official stance was to never comment on anonymous speculation, a policy of dignified silence that had served the Queen for 70 years. But this was different. This felt personal. And as the year turned towards 2023, none of them knew that these whispers were merely the prelude to a storm far more terrifying than any rumor. A storm that would test the truth of the late Queen's alleged doubts in the most brutal way imaginable. A bond forged in the crucible. The year 2023 descended upon the royal family not with the gentle fall of autumn leaves, but with the chilling blast of a winter gale. The rumors about the late Queen's doubts, which had been a low hum in the background, were suddenly and violently silenced by a far more urgent and terrifying reality. In January, Kensington Palace announced that the Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery. It was a brief, controlled statement, designed to manage the narrative and assure the public that her condition was non-cancerous. The family expected a period of quiet recovery. They were wrong. Weeks later, in a move that sent shockwaves through the globe, Buckingham Palace revealed that King Charles himself had been diagnosed with an undisclosed form of cancer. The news was a double blow to a monarchy still finding its feet. The king, just beginning to fill his mother's shoes, was forced to step back from public duties to undergo treatment. The weight of the crown suddenly felt perilously heavy. But the worst was yet to come. As Catherine convalesced at home in Windsor with William and their 3 children, the results of her post-operative tests came back. The news was devastating. Cancer had been found. The Princess of Wales, the woman whose image was synonymous with radiant health and effortless grace, was facing a fight for her life. The world did not know this yet. The palace, still reeling from the king's announcement, asked for privacy, a request that was met with increasing suspicion and a frenzy of wild speculation online. As Catherine retreated behind the walls of Windsor, the digital world erupted with conspiracy theories. Where was she? Why wasn't she seen? The silence, intended to protect her, became a breeding ground for toxicity. For William, it was a waking nightmare. He was facing the very real possibility of losing his wife and his father simultaneously. He had to be strong for his children, for his country, and for Catherine, all while his own world was crumbling. See, it was during this dark spring that the bond between the king and his daughter-in-law deepened into something unbreakable. They were linked not by protocol, but by a shared private battle. They spoke on the phone, 2 patients comparing notes on the indignities and terrors of treatment, finding solace in a mutual understanding that no one else in the family could fully grasp. Charles, from his own sickbed, saw in Catherine's private struggle a public silence that was the ultimate act of service. She was absorbing the world's cruel speculation without a word of defense, protecting her children from the truth until they were ready, protecting the institution of the monarchy from the instability her illness could cause. This, he realized, was not fragility. This was a strength of steel. As the months passed, William was forced to confront the unthinkable. A friend of the family revealed the raw truth of that period. Things were really very tough, the friend confided. Catherine was very ill, and William genuinely had to confront the possibility that he could lose his wife and his father. The experience rewrote Catherine's internal rule book. The near-death experience sparked what was described as a very spiritual and very intense emotional reconnection with life. She emerged from the grueling chemotherapy not just as a survivor, but as a woman transformed. She was more forgiving of herself, less willing to sacrifice her well-being for the sake of appearances. The illness had clarified what truly mattered: her family, her health, and a purpose that felt authentic. By the late summer of 2024, the first tentative signs of spring began to appear in the royal household. Catherine's health improved, and she started to plan her return to public life. The ordeal had forged an invisible chain between her and the king. He had watched her endure, and in doing so, all the old rumors, all the whispered doubts about her resilience were burned away in the fire of her reality. He saw her not just as a daughter-in-law, but as the rock upon which the future of his house would be built. And it was with this absolute certainty that he prepared to share with her a burden he could trust to no one else, the desperate state of his family's broken heart. As Catherine tentatively stepped back into the public eye in the autumn of 2024, her first engagements were met with a wave of public affection that surprised even seasoned royal observers. The silence and speculation of her illness had been replaced by a tangible sense of relief and warmth. People lined the streets not just to see a princess, but to welcome home a survivor. Among those watching her return with the keenest eye was the king's only sister, Anne, the Princess Royal. Anne was the monarch's quiet weapon, a woman who had carved her own path of relentless, unglamorous duty. She rarely gave interviews and held little patience for the emotional theatrics that sometimes surrounded her family. So when she spoke, people listened. In mid-October, during a series of engagements, Anne made a series of comments about Catherine that were picked up by the press, comments that resonated deeply with a public still healing from the scare of the princess's illness. The Anne praised the diligence with which Catherine fulfills her duties, stating it was worthy of the deepest respect. She spoke candidly about the intense pressure on the younger royals, acknowledging that the scrutiny, amplified by social media, was far worse than anything she had faced in her youth. "That's what the media is interested in," Anne noted. "That's hard sometimes to deal with." These were not just casual compliments from an aunt-in-law. To those who understood the family dynamics, Anne's public validation was a significant moment. It was a signal that Catherine had been fully accepted into the inner sanctum of royal work ethic. Anne, who had been her mother's closest confidant, was effectively stamping her approval on the future queen. It felt like a passing of the torch from one generation of dedicated royal women to the next. For Catherine, who was still navigating her new normal post-cancer, Anne's words were a shield against the lingering whispers of the past. But Anne's role in the story was far from over. Behind the palace walls, a secret had been weighing on her. It concerned her mother, the late Queen. In the final years of her reign, Queen Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, had committed her thoughts to paper in a series of private letters. They were not part of the official record, but personal reflections on her family and the future of the institution she had served for 70 years. One of these letters, written during the tumultuous period of Harry and Meghan's departure, contained her thoughts on the future of the monarchy, and specifically, on Catherine. The contents of this letter were known only to a select few, the king, the Princess Royal, and perhaps Sir Edward Young, the Queen's late private secretary. The letter did not contain criticism, as the more lurid tabloids would later speculate, but rather a deep, almost maternal concern. The Queen had written of her observations regarding the pressure on the younger generation, specifically mentioning Catherine's grace under fire, but also wondering about the long-term toll of such relentless scrutiny. It was not a doubt in Catherine's ability, but a fear for her humanity. The Queen had wondered aloud in her elegant script whether the structure of the monarchy, which she had weathered by being born into it, was too heavy a burden for someone who had chosen it. "Grace alone cannot bear the weight of a crown," she had written, and not as a judgment, but as a lament. For months, Anne had wrestled with what to do. The letter was private, a mother's intimate thoughts. Yet, as she watched Catherine fight cancer, as she saw the vile rumors that circulated during her absence, and as she witnessed the media's attempt to pit Diana's memory against Catherine's reality, Anne made a decision. She felt the family's history of silence had often allowed misrepresentation to fester. With the king's reluctant permission, she arranged for the essence of the letter, its protective concern rather than its private anxieties, to be subtly communicated to trusted courtiers and, eventually, to a reputable historian. The goal was not to cause a bombshell, but to reframe the narrative, to show that the late Queen's final thoughts on Catherine were not of doubt, but of a profound and worried love. The revelation, when it surfaced, did not shake the foundation of Catherine's position. Instead, it revealed the late queen as a grandmother who saw the future and worried for the girl who would have to live it. It was a stunning message from beyond the grave, and it served to publicly cement Catherine's destiny, not as a chosen princess, but as the queen's anointed successor, validated by the monarch's deepest, most private concerns. A brutal ultimatum and a fragile bridge. The validation from the late queen, channeled through Princess Anne, should have been a moment of pure relief for the Princess of Wales. Instead, it arrived amidst a storm of a different kind. King Charles, buoyed by his own recovery but deeply aware of his mortality, had decided that the festering wound of his family, the rift with his younger son Harry, could no longer be ignored. The time for passive hope was over. He needed action, and he knew there was only one person in his circle with the subtlety and moral authority to make it happen. In early 2025, with the anniversary of his coronation approaching, Charles delivered what palace insiders described as a brutal ultimatum, though its target was not who the world expected. He did not command William to forgive his brother. He knew that would be futile. Instead, he turned to Catherine. He laid out the stakes with a frankness that the illness had made possible. He spoke of his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, whom he had barely held. He spoke of the monarchy's image, bleeding from 1,000 cuts of leaked stories and recriminations. He spoke of his own legacy, not wanting to be the king under whom the family permanently divided. His message to Catherine was unmistakable. She was the only hope. The king's plea was not a command, but an expectation laden with the weight of the crown. He asked her to be the last viable bridge between the warring brothers. It was an impossible task. To engage with Meghan and Harry was to risk alienating William, her husband, whose anger towards his brother was a living thing, fed by the betrayal of the Netflix series and the brutal honesty of the memoir, Spare. The insider revealed the king's hardened tone. "Everyone needs to grow up," he had apparently exclaimed, frustrated by the trivial and exhausting infighting that overshadowed the serious work of the monarchy, and especially as he and Catherine continued to manage their health. For Catherine, the request landed with the force of a physical blow. She was still fragile, her energy carefully rationed between her children, her public duties, and her recovery. Now she was being asked to broker peace in a war that had been raging for years, a war that had caused her personal pain. She remembered the early days, the reports of a tearful dispute over bridesmaid dresses before Harry's wedding, the misunderstandings that had spiraled into global headlines. She had sent olive branches before, flowers and notes, only to see the conflicts reignited. She had no reason to believe this time would be different. Yet, as she discussed it with William, she saw something shift in his eyes. He was still angry, still hurt by his brother's accusations. But the thought of his father, weakened and pleading for family unity, and the memory of his grandmother's own desperate efforts to keep the family together in her final years forced a crack in his armor. He did not give his blessing, but he gave his silence. He would not stand in her way. The task fell to Catherine to manage the logistics of any potential reconciliation, to handle any future visit from the Sussexes with a care and restraint that would prevent the situation from deteriorating further. Charles was asking her to risk the stability of her own marriage, to potentially cause havoc for the sake of the family's future. It was the heaviest burden she had been asked to bear. It was one thing to represent the crown at a state banquet. It was another to be the sole diplomat in a cold war between two princes. Late at night, as she looked at her own 3 sleeping children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, she understood the king's desperation. He did not want this legacy of estrangement to pass to another generation. He wanted his grandchildren to know their cousins. Catherine, The girl from Berkshire who had married a prince was now being asked to save a family. The weight of it was almost unbearable, but she had not survived cancer to shy away from a challenge. She began, quietly and without any public announcement, to draft a letter. It would not be an apology, for she had done nothing wrong. It would be an opening, a door left ajar, should anyone choose to walk through it. Standing together against the storm. The delicate private work of bridge building was immediately put to the test by the brutal reality of public life. In early 2025, a shadow from the past descended upon the House of Windsor with a vengeance. The long-running legal and personal saga surrounding the king's disgraced brother, Prince Andrew, took a dramatic and ugly turn. New court documents, unsealed in the United States, brought the scandal back to the front pages, painting the monarchy in the worst possible light. It was a crisis that threatened to undo all the goodwill generated by the King's and Catherine's health battles. The tension reached its peak at a major public event, the BAFTA Awards in London, a glamorous night that was supposed to celebrate cinema, but instead became a crucible for the royal couple. The Prince and Princess of Wales decided to attend, a calculated move to show the public that they were focused on national culture and normal life, not just palace scandals. And they walked the red carpet smiling for the cameras, a picture of unity. But the atmosphere was toxic. As they made their way through the crowd, a voice cut through the noise. A heckler, capitalizing on the Andrew probe, shouted a question that hung in the air like smoke. Is the monarchy in peril? The question was aimed directly at their hearts. For a split second, Catherine's composure flickered. A lip reader later revealed the moment of tension. As they navigated the crowd, Catherine, perhaps trying to focus on the well-wishers to block out the hostility, said to William, "Look at the people." But William, ever vigilant, was focused on protecting her from the physical and verbal hazards of the environment. He saw the shifting crowd, the aggressive photographers, the potential for someone to step into her path. His response was a low, urgent whisper meant only for her. "Watch your step." It was a simple, practical instruction, but to those who understood body language, it revealed everything. In that moment, William was not the Prince of Wales. He was a husband guiding his wife through a minefield. A body language expert analyzing the footage noted that Catherine appeared terrified, startled, concerned. The public smile was a mask. Beneath it, the stress of the past years, the illness, the family rift, the constant scrutiny, was visible in the tension around her eyes and the slight rigidity of her posture. But they did not flee. They did not break. They continued down the red carpet. They watched the films. They presented awards. They performed their duty. It was a masterclass in royal stoicism, learned from the best, the late Queen herself. As they sat in the darkness of the Royal Festival Hall, watching the montages of cinematic achievement, William reached over and briefly placed his hand on Catherine's back. It was a gesture unseen by the cameras, a silent communication of solidarity. We are here. We are together. We will get through this. Later that evening, after the event was over and the crowds had dispersed, the couple drove back to Windsor. The car was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only a deep exhaustion. Catherine leaned her head against William's shoulder. They didn't need to speak about the heckler or the probe or the press. They had faced the storm together and had not been blown over. It was in these quiet moments, away from the flashing lights, that their partnership proved its strength. The heckler's question hung in the air unanswered. Now, but the image of the two of them, united and unbroken, was answer enough. They were the future, and they would not be intimidated by the ghosts of the past. The spring of 2026 brought with it a sense of fragile peace. The intense media focus on Prince Andrew had subsided, pushed from the front pages by global events. The king's health was stable, managed with ongoing treatment. And Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had settled into a new rhythm of work, one defined by the boundaries her illness had taught her to set. She was more selective, more focused, and more powerful in her engagements than ever before. It was on a clear, crisp morning at a young people's mental health facility in Surrey that the story came full circle. Catherine was visiting a project she had championed for years, one focused on early intervention for children struggling with trauma. She moved through the room with an easy grace, kneeling to speak to a shy little girl drawing a picture, laughing with a teenager who was showing her a garden they had planted. The transformation was evident to everyone who saw her. The old Kate had been perfect, polished, slightly distant. This Catherine was warmer, more real, touched by a vulnerability that made her accessible. As she was leaving, a journalist from a reputable news outlet, one who had respected her privacy during her illness, was granted a brief, quiet moment. The conversation turned to resilience, to where she found the strength to keep going during the dark times. Catherine spoke generally about her family, about her faith, about the support of the public. But then she paused, and her gaze drifting to a portrait of the late Queen that hung in the facility's reception area. It was a candid photo, the Queen laughing at something, her eyes full of life. Catherine mentioned, almost offhandedly, the recent revelations about her grandmother-in-law's private letters. She did not speak of doubts or fears. Instead, she reframed the entire narrative. She spoke of a message, a stunning message, that had been passed to her through Princess Anne. It was not a warning, Catherine implied, but a commission. The Queen had seen the pressures of the modern world. She had worried for all of them. But in her final reflections, she had written not of her fears for Catherine, but of her hopes. She had seen in her the same quiet, stubborn dedication to duty that she herself had possessed. The late Queen's final message, it delivered from beyond the grave, was one of absolute confidence. When William joined her for the final walk to the car, the journalist asked him about the weight of the past few years. He glanced at his wife, a look of profound, unguarded love on his face. "She is stronger than anyone knows," he said quietly. It was a private thought spoken aloud, a testament to the woman beside him. He had watched her battle cancer, silence her critics, and attempt to mend his broken family, all while raising their children to be kind and grounded. The rumors of the past were dead. King Charles, watching the coverage of the engagement from Buckingham Palace, felt a surge of emotion. He saw in Catherine the embodiment of his mother's legacy and the guarantee of his son's future. She was the bridge not only between his sons, but between the old monarchy and the new. In a private phone call that evening, he told her simply, "I am so proud of you. My mother would have been too." The story of Catherine, Princess of Wales, was no longer just a fairy tale of a commoner who married a prince. It was a story of survival. It was a story of a woman who heard the private doubts of a queen and answered them not with words, but with her life. She had taken the weight of a crown that others thought might crush her and had forged it into armor. The stunning message from the late Queen, once a source of potential pain, had become the foundation of her strength. As she tucked her children into bed that night, reading them stories in the warm glow of Adelaide Cottage, she was not just a princess. She was the matriarch of a future, on the quiet heart of a family, learning to heal. And in the silence, the words of the old Queen seemed to whisper not a doubt, but a blessing carried on the wind across the great park of Windsor.